All right, so we are underway, and I have to start off by saying Hanukkah Sameach. We are coming up to the final night tonight of Hanukkah. I hope everyone has had a great Hanukkah, and I hope everyone had a wonderful Thanksgiving last week. And apologize again for not having class, but I'm sure everyone didn't miss it with all the lovely things they were doing and eating. But time to get back to work here, yes? Yes. So we are now in Parashat Vayigash. We're still in Vayigash. I know it's the cycle's a little bit confusing with Thanksgiving thrown in there, but that means we missed Parashat Miketz. We missed last week's parasha for our discussion. Didn't miss it, hopefully personally, but I want to make sure that we are up to date. That we are up to date on the narrative, because we are following the longest continual narrative of an individual's life in the entire Torah, which is the story of Joseph. And last week, Joseph got to do his big dream interpretation act, right? Where he was elevated in stature, second in command over the entire country, worked out what was going to happen with the feast, then famine, made sure to have lots of leftovers, very appropriate for Thanksgiving. And then his brothers come. And his brothers come, and he suddenly realizes, aha, I finally have this opportunity, and puts them through the ringer. And we begin with the story of Benjamin being accused and of Judah, who was the one who told them, let's all sell Joseph, stepping up and saying, don't do anything to Benjamin. Take me instead. This is the major watershed moment in the relationship of the brothers, of where Joseph can finally see that Judah and the other brothers as well are no longer the same spiteful, vengeful, hateful group, that they do not resent the younger brother the way they did him, that they are not going to make their father suffer the way they did when Joseph was killed, in quotes, and he reveals himself to them. And that's where we're going to pick up. So we're on page 276. And we're right up at the very top of the page in the quotes. It's part of verse 1 from chapter 45. Who'd like to pick us up with have everyone withdraw from me? Please.
Have everyone withdraw from me. So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear. And so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still well?
Now, literally, is my father still alive?
But his brothers could not answer him. So dumbfounded were they on account of him.
All right, so a lot of debate among the Mefarshim, among the commentators, of why does he ask, is my father still alive? Because after all, they have already spent the beginning of this week's parasha and last week's parasha of telling him that Jacob is alive, and that's one of the reasons why they weren't supposed to bring Benjamin. Right? Because if anything happens to Benjamin, then our father will die. So he should already know that his dad's alive. And when Judah was just pleading for Benjamin to be released, one of the main things he argued was, because my father might die if we don't let him go. So why in the world would Joseph be asking this? Well,
they're a bunch of liars. They always have been.
Potentially they could be liars, but it seems to be he's breaking down. It could also be a little bit of rebuke of, see, you finally learned your lesson because you're arguing that our father can't live without Benjamin. I guess you didn't think about that when you killed me. Because if you'd thought about him as much as you do now, then you wouldn't have treated me that way, even if you had hated me the way you did. Right? Sometimes our love of another person can make us put up with people we otherwise wouldn't like.
It also could be that because of the father's reaction when he heard about Joseph, that they knew how the father would react with Benjamin.
Right.
You know, they may not have
that they had learned.
It through.
Right, they had learned. And that's certainly what we hope from our lives, is that when we make mistakes, and we all do, that we will actually learn from them. And I think that there's a lot of good evidence that Joseph, throughout this whole ordeal with the brothers, is truly trying to test them. Not just to yank their chain, not just to make them suffer, but to see whether or not they have truly changed their ways, have changed their character, and are people that can now live together in harmony, because he knows that's going to be necessary. And so the brothers, on the other hand, are dumbfounded. They can't speak at all. Why not? Let's go through the range of emotions. Surprise is maybe the most obvious. How about fear?
Fear.
Right? Fear. It's like all of a sudden they're going, wait a minute. All of the stuff that we've been going through with this guy, he's Joseph. If he's tormented us this much so far, what's he got in store for us next? So there could be fear, or it could be simply guilt. What do you say to someone after all of these years when they've revealed themselves to you? Do you say sorry? Do you say oops? Do you say we didn't mean it? Do you say we grew up, we were not the same people we were? How do you begin that conversation from the guilty side to the person that's just revealed them? And thankfully, Joseph doesn't leave them hanging. He fills it in for them.
Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come forward to me." And when they came forward, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, he whom you sold into Egypt. Now, do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me here. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years that there has been famine in the land, and there are still 5 years to come in which there shall be no yield from tilling. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. So it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of all his household and ruler over the whole land of Egypt."
All right, pause there. We're going to get the whole family reunion, but we're not going to get a chance to read that together. So how does Joseph resolve this tension? Yeah, he lays it at God. He says, God did this all. God made you sell me. God made you hate me? Well, we argued a couple weeks ago that there was a lot of blame about the hate to go around. But he's laying it as being, don't worry, it may have all looked bad, but it's what God wanted. It's what God wanted, because now I'm in a position to help, to save. And this is going to be the question that we're going to debate, which is, how do we know what we're doing is what God actually wants to happen? Because we never get a statement anywhere in the entire Joseph story that God made the brothers sell him. We never get any statement that God reveals to Joseph that this was all part of God's plan. We never get any statement that this really was God's plan. We do know from way back at Abraham that there was going to be this period of enslavement that's coming. But does that mean that all the details were God's plan or not?
I think it also shows that Joseph has learned a great deal too, because he's become more humble. He's learned some stuff from what happened to him. He's not standing saying, "You're all going to bow down to me, and the sun and the moon are going to bow down to me." He's learned some humility, and so he sees that he's not in charge of everything in some way.
That at most he's learned he's part of God's plan, rather than being the one that the sun and the moon are bowing down to. So there's indeed a lot of growing that's gone on for Joseph. He's not the same kid that he was when his brother sold him. But look where he is now. What's the promised land that he's inviting his family to join him in? Egypt. Leaving the land of Israel. And that's okay, right? I mean, Joseph has a nice wife. We can discuss another time about who she was. Joseph lives there. He's done well in the government. He looks enough like an Egyptian and talks enough like an Egyptian that his brothers can't recognize him. Even his own brothers can't recognize him. So apparently assimilation works well. Assimilation was God's plan. Oh? No? We walked down that alley and didn't realize that.
He didn't think so.
What's that?
Joseph didn't think so, because he commanded his bones to be taken back to Israel.
All right, so both Jacob and Joseph are going to demand that they be buried back in the land of Israel. But we do know that their descendants are going to have a hard time leaving. And our tradition certainly lambasts them for having assimilated too much into Egyptian culture. But why wouldn't he have thought that this is what God wanted? That fitting into Egyptian culture got him to a place where he could help his family. If he had told Pharaoh, well, this is what's happening, and this is what's going to go on, but I'm sorry, I can't serve in your government because everybody in your government has to treat you like a god, and I only bow to the one God, then either he would have been back in the pit, or he would have just gone on his merry way. But he certainly would not have been second in command. And so he would not have been able to help this whole family of non-Egyptians come in and live off the storehouses that the Egyptians had made up. That would not have worked. So assimilation apparently paid off in this case. Which brings us to the story of Hanukkah. Like that transition? Okay? Because Hanukkah is the ultimate story about when and how and if we assimilate or acculturate, and what the difference is between the two. Now the difficulty is that we don't think of that as being the main theme of Hanukkah, because many of us have not actually learned the story of Hanukkah. So get ready. Unfortunately, in our allotted time of an hour, we don't have a chance to go through the whole story, but we are going to look at the three different major accounts of the story of Hanukkah. So where do we see the major stories of Hanukkah, the major texts on Hanukkah? Is it in the Torah?
Yeah.
Bible?
Christian Bible.
In some of them, yes. Okay, so we got the book of Maccabees. Excuse me, the book of Maccabees. Anyone ever read that?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to read parts of it today, so don't worry. Where else do we get the story of Hanukkah? What's that? Josephus, in his in his book The Antiquities, which was his explanation of Jewish history to the broader world audience. That's less famous than his book on the wars of the Jews, that describes the war between Israel and Rome. But it's a much longer and more interesting book because it's a much older historical account of Judaism. And Talmud. And these are roughly in chronological order in terms of when they were written. And the Talmud being considerably later. But we're going to start there because I'm sure that the story as related in the Talmud is going to be the one that you're most familiar with. So who'd like to read us a very famous passage of Talmud? You want to keep going, please?
So I'm doing what's the holiday?
What's the holiday Hanukkah?
It is in line with what our rabbis have taught on Tanaite authority. On the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah, which are 8, begin. On these days, it is forbidden to lament the dead and to fast.
All right, so that's the shorthand version of what's Hanukkah. You've got 8 days of celebration beginning on the 25th of Kislev, and during that time period, we don't lament the dead. I was explaining to our Mishnah class on Sunday, this does not mean we don't mourn. It means we do not take excessive steps to increase our grief. The purpose of lamentations over the dead was to make us feel worse, to make us feel more sorrowful. That's why eulogies were designed to make people weep, not to make them laugh in the ancient world. We didn't write a eulogy to be a tribute to a life. We made a eulogy to make ourselves understand our loss. That this person, this wonderful person, was no longer with us, and we should cry more the more we realize what we have lost, rather than being happy that they accomplished so much in their life. It was a different purpose to a eulogy than we currently see in most funerals these days. So those types of eulogies were not permitted during Hanukkah. You're not allowed to make a eulogy that's going to make people sadder than they already are from death. You're not going to purposely increase that, and you can't take on personal fasts. Another tradition which is not in common vogue in the current world. But for why are we doing this?
For when the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they made all of the oil that was in the sanctuary unclean. But when the rule of the Hasmonean house took hold and they conquered them, they searched, but found only a single jar of oil lying with the seal of the high priest. But that jar had enough oil only for a single day. But there was a miracle done with it, and they lit the lamp with it for 8 days. The next year, they assigned these days and made them festival days for the recitation of Hallel and for Thanksgiving. All
right, so we sing Hallel during Hanukkah, and if you were here on Shabbat or if you've been attending Minyan, you will have gotten your fill, hopefully, of those beautiful songs. And for Thanksgiving, we also include in Modim, the blessings that we do on our prayers, and our Amidah, a special paragraph which reminds ourselves of the victory of the Maccabees. That's for those of you who are here on Friday or Saturday when I say we continue with the Amidah, including the special insertion for Hanukkah. That's what we're talking about. All right? Why are we celebrating Hanukkah, according to the Talmud?
That's that oil thing.
Oh yeah, okay, so we've got oil. What's that?
Miracle that it lasted 8 days.
Oh,
There's no mention of that in Maccabees.
well, we're not there yet. One piece at a time, one piece at a time. All right, so we've got oil, and from the oil, it lasted 8 days of burning, and that's why we celebrate for 8 days. Right? Very simple. And who is our enemy in the story from the Talmud?
Says the Greeks.
Says the Greeks, right? Gotta take it at its face value. The Greeks. Okay, so we got that down. We're fighting the Greeks. We defeat them. We put oil in the menorah in the temple. It burns longer than it should. Holiday. No problem so far, right? I mean, in terms of understanding. We're going to compare the different stories. So if you have some questions about that, just hold on to it. As we see some of the other stories, maybe you'll be able to phrase the question with more detail. All right. Now we're going to get Josephus.
When they came to Jerusalem and found the temple deserted, its gates burned down, and the plants were in the temple, they wept at the sight of the temple. So he gave them an order to fight the men that guarded the upper city until he has purified the temple.
This is Judah the Maccabees giving the orders.
When he had cleansed it, he brought in new vessels, the menorah, the table, and the incense altar, which were made of gold, and hung up the veils of the doors and restored the doors themselves. He also took down the altar and built a new one of stones that he had gathered together, and such as had not been hewn with iron tools.
All right. So what's a little bit different here?
They haven't discovered any oil.
Okay, no oil being mentioned and all the cleanup, right? What also is new in the cleanup?
Why the concern about iron?
Well, the not having an altar from hewn stones is a requirement that the Torah talks about. But the question here is, why would they need a new altar?
It's defiled.
Because it had been defiled, because they had been sacrificing all sorts of pagan things on that altar. So we couldn't just pretend like that altar had not been used for idolatrous purposes, and we couldn't assume that people would equally assume that any future sacrifices were not for the idolatrous purposes that that altar had been used for. So we had to remove them and put in a new altar so that everyone would understand this altar is only been used and only will be used for the service of God. Make sense? Anyone notice that we got a new menorah? Right? We didn't. You'll see in all the cartoon versions, you'll see them taking the menorah and picking it up and putting it back and polishing it. No, they had to make a new menorah. What happened to the old menorah? Sold for scrap. It was made from gold. Right? When our enemies, and we're leaving that term ambiguous for the moment, when our enemies came in, they took the gold. And for them, a gold menorah wasn't a beautiful spiritual object. For them, the gold menorah was a giant pile of cash. All you had to do was melt it down, pour it into coins, and boom, your treasury had more gold. So in order to rededicate the temple, they had to remake the menorah. There's nothing special about the oil being mentioned, nothing special about the menorah being found. It's just you remake this. Not easy. Were there other questions, comments? Yeah.
How many arms did the old menorah have? And did they make it exactly the same, or did they?
Yep, they made it with the exact same. We don't have any mention yet about the number of days. It would have been made with the 7 of the original, because that's what the menorah in the temple was supposed to have. And in fact, the idea of having a dedicated menorah that we now call a Hanukkah is a relatively new, Jewish terms, only hundreds of years old, relatively new idea. It used to be that you would simply light a lamp that you were dedicating this night as being your menorah lamp, your Hanukkah. You didn't necessarily have a lamp that you only took out 8 days of the year. You would just use a regular lamp, but dedicated for that purpose. Same thing, by the way, for Shabbat lamps. You didn't necessarily have Shabbat candlesticks that were only used Friday night. You would just have lights that you lit specifically for Shabbat in your regular lamps. And you would say the blessing over that.
And on the 25th day of the month of Kislev,
All right, we agree about the date.
good, they lit the lights that were on the menorah and offered incense upon the altar and laid the loaves upon the table and offered whole burnt offerings upon the new altar.
All right, so lighting the menorah is only one of a collection of different activities that would have been done to signal the rededication, the resanctification of the temple. Right? Getting the incense going again, getting the loaves of bread that were always kept in the temple going again, and getting the sacrifices going again. That was all part and parcel of the daily routine of the temple. And now it's up and running again.
As it happened, these things took place on the very same day on which, 3 years before, the worship had become idolatry. For the temple had remained desolate for 3 years after being made so by Antiochus. And the desolation of the temple came about in accordance with the prophecy of Daniel, which had been made 408 years before.
All right, so there's passages in the book of Daniel that are being read by Josephus as being a prophecy for both the desecration and dedication of the temple. And the significance of the date here is that it is 3 years to the day from when they conquered. Now, hopefully you get a scope, just a taste of the beginning of the Wars of the Maccabees. Right? Again, because oftentimes in the cartoon book version, you have Antiochus coming in, making his proclamation, the Maccabees saying, no, fighting back, and a week later we're celebrating Hanukkah. Right? But just like the American Revolution took a lot of time, a lot longer than just 1776, this revolution took a lot longer. And from the moment they began fighting to the dedication of the temple was 3 years. And the war wasn't done yet. We'll talk about that more in a minute.
And so Judah and his fellow citizens celebrated the festival of the restoration of the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days, and omitted no sort of pleasure, but everyone feasted upon very rich and splendid sacrifices. And they honored God and delighted themselves with songs of praise and the playing of harps. Indeed, they were so very glad at the revival of their customs, and, after so long a time, having unexpectedly regained their right to worship, that they made it a law for their posterity, that they should keep a festival celebrating the restoration of their temple worship for 8 days. And from that time to this, we celebrate this, which we call the Festival of Lights, because, I imagine, beyond our hopes, this rite was brought to light.
Okay, so we're not even calling it Hanukkah, we're calling it Chagurim, the Festival of Lights, which you'll still hear people use as a reference for Hanukkah to this day. But this is as near as we can tell, the origin of that title, or at least the earliest attestation of that title. And why are we celebrating it? What was the purpose? Oil?
No.
Restoration.
Dedication.
They celebrated for 8 days.
Rededication of temple, right? So it was freedom to worship. Oh man, I know English, honest. All right, freedom to worship, to restore our right to have our sacrificial services.
Why did they pick 8 days?
Doesn't say, does it? Doesn't say. So we're still left with 8 days, but we got nothing to hang it on. We just have this number pulled out of a hat, 8 days long, and that's a bit of a head scratcher. Of why would it have been 8 days long that they would celebrate? I mean, you might just simply think, well, most of our big festivals in Judaism are about a week long. Throw an extra day on for extra celebration, and boom, we got a holiday. It could have been as simple as that, but it doesn't say explicitly.
I had read something else, which is that this happened in December, and because the temple was all schmutzig, they couldn't do Sukkot 2 months before. So this was a late Sukkot celebration, that were making up for what they had missed before. Sukkot is the 8 days.
Josephus doesn't say that.
No, he doesn't.
Wait for the next text.
Oh, there will be some. Oh, okay, I'm going to skip that.
So Josephus does not say that. Josephus simply says that this is a festival of our freedom to worship that happened the last 8 days long, and all of the emphasis is on that restoration and rededication, beautification of the temple. Right? Now, before we go on and see the contrast with the book of Maccabees, who was Josephus?
He was a
He was a
Roman.
Roman.
Well, he became a vassal of Rome. He became a servant of Rome. He had been a Jewish general during the original war against Rome in 70, the war when the temple was destroyed. And he had surrendered rather than fight to the last man. So he doesn't exactly have a great reputation among the Jews. And he wrote a very long story called The War of the Jews that explained why the war happened for the Roman audience. He wasn't explaining why the war happened for the Jewish audience. He was trying to explain it to the Roman audience. Why?
Survival
Survival of what and who?
of himself and a little bit of the Jewish ideals.
Well, we could maybe give a little bit more credit than that, but he definitely wanted to survive himself, but he could have simply said, look, I'm Josephus, right? The name Joseph with the good old Roman ending, right? He's Josephus. He could have just gone into being Josephus, become completely Roman, completely pagan, and disappeared into history and not done anything. But he tried in the War of the Jews to explain that the war was caused by the Zealots, that the war was caused by the rabble-rousers. The war was caused by the people that were what we would call fundamentalists.
But he was a historian also. That was intrinsic in him.
Okay, and so when he finally had a chance, having hopefully persuaded the Romans that it isn't something intrinsic to Jews that made us revolt, but that it was something intrinsic to this fundamentalist offshoot, he was trying to say to Rome, therefore we're not dangerous. We're not a dangerous people. And if you let me explain the glory of our history, the book of Antiquities that he wrote, you'll see that not only are we not a threat, but we could be a light in the Roman Empire. He wasn't arguing for political independence. Remember, that was the fight that we had in the Revolution. He was arguing for freedom to worship. His big goal, in both the Antiquities as well as the War of the Jews, was to encourage the Romans to relax their restrictions and allow us to rebuild the temple and to restore service. So when he retells the story of the Maccabees, guess what he emphasizes? The military victories, the might of the Maccabees with God on their side against an oppressive, occupying regime? No. that would not be the smartest way to sell your merchandise, to get your idea across. He emphasizes that the Maccabees were fighting for and achieved the right to worship, the right to have the temple, the right to have their Judaism, to have their customs and their culture be respected and be observed by their people. And if Rome would just do the same, ... you're not going to get any more trouble out of us, is Josephus's message. We're not going to fight against you anymore. We're not going to rebel. We'll be good little citizens. We'll pay our taxes. Just let us have our worship back. Because we're really not that bad a people. I know it's probably hard to imagine, but Jews were considered extremely violent in the Roman Empire. We were considered to be very, very, what's the right word for it? Militant. Militant's a good word. We were a difficult group. As much as there's a reputation for Jews as being argumentative in the modern world, take that argumentation and put a spear in it, and you get the impression that the Romans had of us, which was we were not good vassals of Rome. We were not easy for them to rule. And Rome was of the opinion that the best way to handle the Jewish problem was simply to keep stomping on them until they stopped getting up. Never really a good solution to people who keep getting up when you stomp on them. But Josephus was trying to explain to them, stop stomping. You're just making the fundamentalists, the zealots, more powerful. Let us get up, let us rebuild, and we will remove all the reason that those crazy guys are fighting against you, because we'll be able to go back to having our temple and our worship and our customs, and we'll just be quiet and sit in the corner of the Mediterranean and pay our taxes. Thank you very much. Make sense?
Things
Okay.
haven't changed, have they?
You know, the more things don't change, the more I am reassured that the texts that our ancestors left us and that God gave us are still applicable, and thank God. Because if we have the same problems, then we've already been given the answer key. It's like when you go into high school and the teacher was still giving the same test that he gave your older brother or sister. You shouldn't be upset that the teacher hasn't changed it. You should be good. Now I know exactly what to do to win. And we already know what we need to do to win. Now we just have to do it. Okay, getting back to the book of Maccabees though.
And they celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the Feast of Booths, remembering how not long before, during the Feast of Sukkot, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals.
All right, so the book of Maccabees fills in a question of why 8? Because it was Sukkot plus Shmini Atzeret. Right, in the fall, after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when many people are exhausted from shul, we get this wonderful holiday called Sukkot, which lasts for 7 days. We add an additional day in the diaspora, but they're in the land of Israel, so it lasts 7 days. The day after, we have another holiday called Shmini Atzeret, 7 plus 1, 8 days. The book of Maccabees, the oldest explanation of the story of the Maccabees, says that's why it's 8.
And that takes away anything about a miracle. This wasn't a miracle, the Maccabees were good fighters. It doesn't have God in it. It doesn't have God protecting them. They don't mention that at all. It's just they were good fighters. They finally got it back, and now they can celebrate a holiday that they missed a couple months before.
Well, it takes away the supernatural element of the miracle of the oil. I would be uncomfortable saying it takes away the miracle, but it certainly recasts the miracle.
The way they have looked at it, they looked at it as their power. Now maybe God was on their side,
They
but
certainly-
they're not mentioning, the way in the Purim story, we don't have God mentioned either.
Well, let's keep reading. So that's the summary from Maccabees 2 that gives the time frame. But the book of Maccabees, the first book of Maccabees, gives the story in more detail. It doesn't mention Sukkot explicitly, but it does give more of the detail of what happened when the temple was retaken.
Early in the morning on the 25th of the 9th month, that is the month of Kislev, in the year 148, they arose and offered a sacrifice according to the law on the new altar of offerings that they had made.
All right, so just like Josephus, there's definitely an agreement that the altar had been rebuilt.
Okay. On the anniversary of the day on which the Gentiles had defiled it, on that very
Which
day,
is also agreeing with what Josephus said.
on that very day, it was reconsecrated with songs, harps, flutes, and cymbals. All the people prostrated themselves and adored and praised heaven, who had given them success.
All right, so who gave the success? Was it just the doughty fighters of the Maccabees? No, they believed that their success was from God as well.
Wonderful. For 8 days, they celebrated the dedication of the altar and joyfully offered burnt offerings and sacrifices of deliverance and praise.
All right, so pause for a second. For 8 days, they celebrated the dedication of the altar. Should also ring a certain echo. That may be another reason why this book of Maccabees, the first book of Maccabees, doesn't bother mentioning Sukkot. When the first altar was dedicated, way back in the book of Exodus, how long did it take? It took about 8 days. There were 7 days of purification and then the dedication. So it may be that the 8 days was chosen actually as an echo for how long it took to dedicate the first one. And that may have been why 8 was chosen. Keep going.
They ornamented the facade of the temple with gold crowns and shields. They repaired the gates and the priests' chambers and furnished them with doors. There was great joy among the people now that the disgrace of the Gentiles was removed. Then Judah and his brother and the entire congregation of Israel decreed that the days of the dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness on the anniversary every year for 8 days from the 25th day of the month of Kislev. At that time they built high walls and strong towers around Mount Zion to prevent the Gentiles from coming and trampling over it as they had done before. Judah also placed a garrison there to protect it, and likewise fortified Beit Zur, that the people might have a stronghold facing Idumea.
Okay. What do we notice in the second paragraph there, or the very end of the at that time? About the building of the fortress and the walls and
Yes.
what does that tell you?
The war was still going.
The war was still going on. The war wasn't over. They captured Jerusalem in the 3rd year of the war. The final peace between us and our enemies, which we haven't explained just yet, took 25 years. I know it doesn't make it into pop-up books like that. Okay, so as soon as they finished this 8 days worth of celebration, they picked up their swords and their shields as well as their hammers and chisels, and continue to rebuild the walls, and build new fortifications, and go out to new battles. And almost all of the Maccabee brothers would be dead by the last time. Only one Maccabee brother survived the entire ordeal. Okay, so again, that doesn't make for a good pop-up book. It doesn't make for a good animated, special on TV. And certainly, I Have a Little Dreidel is a more fun song to sing. But the Book of Maccabees tells it much more cleanly, much more clearly, that this was a dedication in the midst of the fight. The same way that the Declaration of Independence was in the middle of our War of Independence, not after our independence was won, or not right before our independence was done, and not even before we started fighting, but more as a way of rejuvenating and re-inspiring the people who were already in the fight. So too was the retake of Jerusalem and the rededication of the temple. All right, but who were we fighting, and what were we fighting, and why did I bother talking about assimilation at the beginning of this class? Okay, now we get to the very beginning of the Book of Maccabees, which spells it out quite nicely.
After Alexander the Macedonian, Philip's son, who came from the land of Kitim, had defeated Darius, king of the Persians and the Medes, he became king in his place, having first ruled in Greece.
All right, so everybody love having history lessons, right? So the Babylonians came and kicked us out and took us off to Babylon in captivity. How did we get back?
Alexander.
Something in between. The Persians. Not Darius, there was...
Darius was dead.
Exactly, right? So, what's that? No, it was, with a C. My brain just faded. Cyrus. So Cyrus sets us free and rebuilds the temple, or helps us rebuild the temple, and we are reestablished in the land of what will become called Judea, or Judah, which is, if you look at the back of the two pieces, you'll see a heavy dotted line right there around Jerusalem. That's it. That little circle right there around Jerusalem, that was the province in the Persian Empire that we occupied following the Restoration. All right, when the Persians let us go, they didn't give us the whole country back. They let us restore ourselves to that tiny little pocket of land, smaller than Rhode Island, around the city of Jerusalem. That was around, it was 586 that we were defeated by the Babylonians, and if you can do the math, about 510, 516, 70 years later, we returned, and then we began the process of, in fits and starts, of rebuilding Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. And we are then a vassal state, really more of a city-state, of the Persian Empire. We are not free. Everybody got that? We are not free. We're not independent. We don't have our own independent national army. We send our taxes, our tribute to Persia, and we are allowed to worship as we like, have our customs as we like, have our observances as we like. So we're free as a community, but we're not free as a nation. Along comes Alexander the Great, as the Book of Maccabees explains, and he kicks the Persians in the teeth and conquers them as well as Egypt and everything else that he can find that's worth conquering at the time, since Europe was just a pit. And he walks by and says, oh, by the way, I just beat up the Persians, so you're part of my empire now. And we go, okay. So we should make the check out to who?
Yeah, right.
And we sent him the tribute that we used to be sending to the Persians. But Alexander had a policy that we were free to continue our worship, our observance, and the traditions of our people as we had before. All right, so that everyone's up to speed now with that first sentence. Babylonians beat us up, Persians restore us, but we remain a vassal. The Macedonian/Greek army comes through, defeats the Persians, they keep us as a vassal, and onward. He advanced to the ends.
Alexander advanced to the ends of the earth, gathering plunder from many nations. The earth fell silent before him, and his heart became proud and arrogant. After all this, he took to his bed, realizing that he was going to die. He therefore summoned his officers, the nobles, who had been brought up with him from his youth, to divide his kingdom among them while he was still alive. His officers took over his kingdom, each in his own territory, and after his death, They all put on royal crowns, causing much distress over the earth.
Okay. Well, what happens when one king leads 3 kingdoms? Do you think any one of those kingdoms was happy with what they got? No. And having been raised with the notion that the way you get more is by conquering, because that's how they got their kingdoms in the first place, was by Alexander's conquests, guess what they began to do? Fight. So if you look on the inside of the back, you have here in 323 Alexander dies, right? And we have 3 separate kingdoms that form, right? We have the Antigonid Empire, which is Macedonia and Greece, not important for our story. We have the Ptolemaic Kingdom, which is in Egypt and us, originally, when it was being divided up. Rather important, as we're going to see. And we have the Seleucid Empire, which is basically the whole middle of that Asian place. The Syria, Iraq, and on into Persia. Everyone got that? Those are the 3 big kingdoms that were left. Keep going. In those days,
Oh, in those days, there appeared in Israel men who were breakers of the law, and they seduced many people, saying, "Let us go and make an alliance with the Gentiles all around us. Since we separated from them, many evils have come upon us." The proposal was agreeable. Some from among the people promptly went to the king, and he authorized them to introduce the way of living of the Gentiles. Thereupon, they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the Gentile custom. They covered over the mark of their circumcision and abandoned the Holy Covenant. They allied themselves with the Gentiles and sold themselves to wrongdoing.
all right. Has the war with the Maccabees begun? No. Who currently controls the land of Israel? Is it the Seleucid Antiochus or is it the Ptolemies?
Should be some.
It's the Ptolemies. So who is forcing assimilation?
He's forcing it.
Well, who's driving the agenda?
Seducing them.
Ptolemy.
What's that?
Ptolemy.
No. Who's driving the agenda?
The guys who were evildoers.
The Jews. The Jews. Well, not all of them.
No, the fundamentalists.
Well, the non-fundamentalist, they're the fundamentalist assimilationists, exactly. They're people who believe that assimilation is the key to the Jewish problem, right? That the biggest problem for the Jews is that we're not like everyone else.
Right.
And if we were just like everyone else, then bad stuff wouldn't happen to us. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Like you said, we haven't changed. Unfortunately, in this particular respect. So they begin a campaign to encourage people to become more, and this is where it gets easily confused, Greek-like. Because when Alexander came through, he spread Greek culture. He did not leave behind ethnically Greek people very much, except for whatever his soldiers produced in their plunder and pillage, but he did leave behind the hallmarks of Greek culture. That's why we're talking about gymnasiums here. So these people decide that the culture they're going to assimilate with is the Greek culture. But we're not talking about the Greek Empire anymore. We're not talking about Greek nationals. We're talking about Greek ideas. That makes sense? That's why it gets confusing when people say that we fought against the Greeks. Because there was no one with a Greek passport involved in this battle. Make sense? Okay. So, what did people do to fit in?
Hide the circumcision,
Hide the circumcision. How do you hide a circumcision? Why do you need to hide a circumcision?
because it identifies you as a Jew and different.
But who gets to see that?
Because
Oh, the guys in the gym where they work out without clothes on.
Because Greek culture was real big on male nudity. How many of you have seen Greek statues that had full-length togas?
Yeah, right.
No.
No.
The human body, and in particular for the Greeks, the male body, was considered especially beautiful. And part of their estimation of male beauty was not much here. That was meant to be hidden and covered. That was their idea of male beauty. And the idea that you would deliberately expose more of it was repugnant to them. That was considered barbarous. And since the gymnasium was not just the gym for working out and hanging out in the locker room, but was the seat of cultural discourse and discussion, You would go to the gym to also talk, to make connections, the same way the country club in the 50s and 60s worked for Americans. The Jews wanted to be able to fit in. Well, you don't fit in when everyone sees that you ain't one of them. So through a series of weights and clips, you would stretch out the skin from around that area until you had a elongated flap that would be a fake foreskin. All right, yeah, uncomfortable.
Yes, yeah.
But it was the price of admission.
Things you do to fit in.
The things you do to fit in. It was the price of admission to get into the country club, to get into the circle of the movers and shakers, of the people who would do right. Now, is that wrong? Right? I mean, how do we not know that this isn't what God wanted? I mean, these people aren't saying our ways are stupid. They're saying we keep suffering because we don't fit in. We keep making problems for ourselves. If we could just get to know them better and let them know us, and if we could just break down the barriers, we wouldn't have these problems. I mean, clearly God wants us to do well. God wants us to succeed. God doesn't want us to suffer. And if the thing that's keeping us apart, the thing that's making us suffer is our own stubbornness, then why would we expect God to fix that? Clearly all we need to do is assimilate better and the problems will go away. And they were, and I appreciate the slight mislabeling, they were fundamentalists in this. They believed that assimilation was mandated as being something we must do in order to better the Jewish people.
If they assimilated,
Right.
did that mean that they totally did away with their own religion? Or were there still ways in which they practiced Judaism?
We have always been a very eclectic people. From the time before the first temple was destroyed, and to a lesser degree afterwards, Jews were really big on the whole smorgasbord. I know we didn't have the word yet, but you'll find from most ancient Jewish homes dedications to God, that is to say, the God, and you'll also find little statues and little idols or little shrines. Most Jews did not see it as being mutually contradictory. They thought they could worship God and worship any other pantheon they wanted. So the idea that you could be both, the idea that you could adopt large chunks of Gentile culture and not cease to be Judean, or what we later would call Jews, is not impossible for them to hold in their mind. Indeed, we see to this day many people that, to take the most extreme example, who say there's nothing wrong and nothing un-Jewish about a person who decides to worship Jesus. It's like, well, you still remain legally a Jew the same way that an American may legally retain an American citizenship no matter what opinions they espouse, but that's not what Judaism talks about, and you have given up on Judaism if you have taken that step. So they didn't see it that way. Internally to them, they thought it made as much sense as saying Jews for Jesus. Jews for Greeks was perfectly fine for them. And even better, it meant that you wouldn't have the suffering that the Jews had undergone if you just had more people join this movement. So it sounds good, right?
But it was in complete conflict with the idea of worshiping one God.
Well, there's that it's in conflict with the idea of worshiping one God. I mean, yeah, Shema Yisrael and all that. If you want to get picky. But the thing is, our people, both then and now, have never been loath to pick what they wanted to emphasize in one way or another from their Judaism. Like I said, we like the smorgasbord. One from column A and two from column B is a very Jewish behavior, even if Judaism doesn't always approve. And so, yes, it is the height of contradictory within Judaism to say, I'm going to have other gods alongside God, alongside Elohim, alongside Adonai. But for a Jew to say that is par for the course in our history. And that's kind of the problem.
Because of survival?
Because of survival, because we are often fickle, because there is something attractive and seductive about both other cultures and idolatry itself. It is kind of a wonderful, warm, fuzzy, addictive feeling. And we see time and time again that even in the modern world, Jews who don't worship actual idols certainly fill that void with other material obsessions. So, yeah, it's a very strong tendency to lean that way and to justify it. They didn't say, we want to do this because we think the Gentile ways are better. They said, the problem is that there's too much distance between us and them. They don't know us well enough. And if we can just get rid of that, then we won't have to suffer. So they weren't setting out, and at least it wasn't their stated agenda, to get rid of Judaism. They just wanted to make things better for everyone. And if that meant, some painful clips and weights, well, that was a small price for me to pay to help the Jewish people. Again, to underscore, there is an underlying layer here of what does it mean to be helping Judaism and what does it mean to be helping the Jewish people. We often treat the two completely synonymously, and yet we also often treat them as being completely separate. There are many people who are very proud of their Jewish culture who do nothing that is actually part of Judaism, or do very little that is part of Judaism, or do things that might be in direct conflict with Judaism. They celebrate their Jewish culture by having menorah and dreidel ornaments on their Christmas tree.
Hanukkah bush.
Or a Hanukkah bush. If they want to be really, really frum, they'll have a Hanukkah bush rather than a Christmas tree. But even people who have completely assimilated, become Christian, they are still proud of their Jewish ancestry, of the Jewish culture. And they'll have bagel and lox on Christmas morning. While they're opening their Christmas presents, and they'll have, like I said, you can see them. They have dreidel and menorah ornaments to go on Christmas trees to celebrate that cultural heritage rather than the religious. So it shouldn't surprise us that 2,000 years ago there were people who thought much the same. It's a little bit more complicated to do the things they did than just hanging an ornament, but the impetus was the same. Okay, so now that we've got the lines drawn within Judaism, within the Jewish world, let's see what happens.
When his kingdom seemed secure, Antiochus proposed to become king of Egypt so as to rule over both kingdoms. He invaded Egypt with a strong force, with chariots and elephants, and with a large fleet to make war on Ptolemy, king of Egypt. Ptolemy was frightened at his presence and fled, leaving many casualties. The fortified cities in the land of Egypt were captured, and Antiochus plundered the land of Egypt.
And guess what was part of the booty? The land of Israel. Which, look at the back picture, right? We were just that. Right, we were this little province, part of the Ptolemaic Empire, and when Antiochus came down into Egypt and wiped out the Egyptian armies, when he went back home, this land was now part of the Seleucid Empire. So we now fall under the reign of Antiochus. Now where Ptolemy and the Ptolemaic Empire had been supportive of those Jews who wanted to assimilate, who wanted to turn Judea into a Greek city-state kind of notion, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, that's the famous Antiochus of the story, becomes very proactive and decides that not only should these people who want to assimilate be supported, but those who seek to fight or argue against them must be crushed. And that's where you get the famous stories about them coming through, of changing the temple into a pagan shrine, of forcing people to sacrifice pork and not allowing us to study Torah, to keep Shabbos, to do circumcisions at all. That comes as part of a pro-assimilation government campaign, as opposed to a passive support like the Ptolemies had been doing.
Is that when the scholars fled to Tzfat?
No.
Time?
No, that's a different time, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is where we begin to have all of those famous practices of, what do we do to study and keep Judaism under this level of persecution? And it happens in Modi'in, of course, famously, that when they come to this provincial town, which is near Jerusalem, so it's still within that border of Judea, that they ask the local Kohen, Matityahu, to come and sacrifice and eat from the sacrifice of a pig. And he says, no, not going to do it. And he calls his sons, and they kill the other local official who will do it, and Jewish local official, and they run to the hills, they gather a rebel army, and they begin to fight back. Now, remember, they're fighting back against the empire that just beat up Egypt. Relative size, people. All right? We're this. We're not all of this. We're this. And we already have essentially an ideological civil war in our midst among those who want to assimilate and those who don't, and those who just are in the middle. And he decides to fight back against the army that is now forcing assimilation, as opposed to that passive kind of support that they had been getting. Anyone want to put odds in Vegas? All right, so that is why we consider the victory of the Maccabees to be a miracle. Because there's no reason why one guy and 5 kids who hide up in the mountains should have been able to even gather a force, let alone their tiny force would be able to defeat them. And yet they were. And so we actually continue to exist as a people. Because look at the options, right? The options would have been that we would have been crushed and everyone would have realized there's no point fighting back, or that we would have not fought at all, at which point the assimilation program would have gone ahead and Jews as an ethnic people might have continued to exist, but Judaism would not. And that's a very important distinction, because this is the first recorded fight in human history that wasn't over dirt or stuff. We were not fighting for our freedom of land. We were not fighting for our freedom to own more things. We weren't fighting to keep our gold, our houses, even our wives or families. We were fighting for the right to keep our faith, to not be forced into this program of assimilation. That sets the stage for every successful and worthwhile revolution that ever happened. Without the Maccabees and their victory, without that model of there are some things that are worth fighting for that aren't things, we would not be standing in this room today. You would not have had the French Revolution, the American Revolution. You wouldn't have had, quite likely, things like the Industrial Revolution, without the idea that ideas matter and that the freedom to be who you want to be matters. It would have continued to be a hierarchical, dictated society where your culture, your choices, and your thoughts were controlled by the people who had more spears. That's a miracle. And that's worth celebrating. And it's worth reminding ourselves that, yes, there are times when acculturation is appropriate, where we can borrow from the sciences and from some of the philosophy of other cultures. And indeed, the rabbis themselves, the sages of the Talmud, do describe some things that were borrowed from Greek culture. Some of the words that are used are from Greek culture. But to assimilate to the point of abandoning Judaism and thinking that Jewishness is all we really need, that we can just become Josephus, but we still got the Joseph, so that must be okay. No. The reason why Josephus, for all of his warts and blemishes, is still, I think, a Jew, is because he kept fighting for the right to reestablish Judaism in freedom. He knew that he wasn't going to convince the Romans to let us be free territorially. But he at least thought there was a chance to be free Jewishly in our actual faith. And we as individuals have to keep fighting for that as well. It's not enough to simply be Jewish culturally. We have to continue to make good this opportunity we have to be Jewish faith in our religion, in all of our actions, not just the lox and bagels. There's one little text there which we've run out of time, but you're welcome to peruse, which is the text from the story last week when Joseph gets a new name. He doesn't get called Josephus, he gets called some horrible Egyptian contraption, which I'm not going to try and pronounce. And he gets married to a woman from among the Egyptians, and he has children, which seems like he is putting distance between himself and his family, saying, I've forgotten my father's house, I made it here in the land of my affliction, I've cut everything off, which is why it's so poignant in this parasha, that when he finally sees his brothers and realizes he can be with his family again, that's why the tears well up uncontrollably. Because no matter how far he cut himself off, no matter how much he tried to pretend he wasn't part of Jacob's family, that was still calling to his soul. And when he confronted his brothers face to face, it sang out to him. It's also interesting to note on the back that if you look at the dark line, by the time the Hashmonean dynasty, which is the kingdom that the Maccabees form, is done, before the Romans take over, we'd carved out a lot more territory for ourselves. Yeah, they were not content with just being the city-state around Judah. And that's probably a little bit more similar to the modern map of Israel that you might be familiar with. And perhaps because of them is one of the reasons why we have a notion of Israel as being more than just 10 miles around Jerusalem. And God willing, it will remain so. Have a good last night of Hanukkah, and hope to see everyone on Shabbat.